He hadn't meant to idealize her, to place her on a pedestal so high she'd be dizzy from the altitude. He hadn't meant to overwhelm her with the sheer weight of his feelings, the unspoken pressure of his projections. But how could he have resisted? She was radiant, a sunbeam cutting through the muted beige tones of the dusty old building where the language exchange met. She drew people in effortlessly, shaking their hands with a firm, confident grip, pulling up chairs from other tables, making space for anyone who needed it. "Are you the organizer?" someone had asked, mistaking her easy command for a formal title. "No," she'd laughed, the sound a light melody. She was a simple woman in a floral sundress who just knew how to make people feel seen and welcome. What was her name again? He had heard it once, a fleeting syllable lost in the hum of conversation, and now it was a ghost of a sound he was desperate to conjure. And then she turned that same light on him. Matthew felt her warmth, her focused gaze, her genuine questions as a physical presence, a force field of curiosity that wrapped around him, making his skin prickle. He stirred in his seat, the plastic chair groaning in protest, and gripped the neck of his beer bottle so tightly his knuckles turned white. It was a nervous reflex, a tremor that belonged not to him but to some separate, jittery entity that lived just under his skin, always threatening to break free. "What does your tattoo mean?" she asked, leaning in, her hands on the edge of her seat as if to anchor her curiosity against the pull of his quiet intensity. There was something so disarmingly young and endearing about her, a juvenile energy that made her gap-toothed smile all the more captivating. It was a smile that didn't just appear on her face, it took over her whole being, crinkling the corners of her eyes and making her cheeks blush. "I drew it," Matthew managed to say, the words a rough rasp in his throat. It was a ghost, a small, sad illustration he'd scribbled in his notebook on the day his father had ignored his brand new shoes. He'd traded his scruffy Vans and their worn tongues for a pair of polished leather loafers because he thought that real men, not boys, wore real shoes. He had hoped for a simple acknowledgement, a nod of approval, but his father had just looked right through him. "Really?" she said, her eyes wide with the genuine surprise he wasn't used to. "What does it mean?" It was a cliché question, the kind strangers always asked, but coming from her it felt like the most profound inquiry in the world, a key to a locked door he didn't even know he wanted to open. I think I felt invisible," he confessed, the words a low murmur. "What does that feel like?" she asked in return, her head tilted, her eyebrows furrowed with a sincere confusion. "Right. How would someone so visible, so capable of filling a room with her presence, ever understand what it felt like to be unseen, to be a ghost in your own home, to feel like a reflection on a foggy mirror? And how could he have known then that she was more than just a bubbly personality, a pretty face, and a question mark? He was already constructing her in his mind, adding layers of his own desperate needs, assigning her qualities that might not exist, but that he desperately wanted to believe were real. He saw her not just as a person, but as a solution, a balm for the invisibility he had carried with him for so long. The second time they met was at a cafe. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and worn leather. Pamphlets for local events were scattered across the windowsill, a testament to a world that existed beyond their small table. "Do you listen to everything others say, or do you stare through them, seeing what isn't there?" Matu's hands were jittery as he spoke, answering her endless stream of questions. Had she noticed his hands trembling, his voice rustling as lightly as leaves in a breeze? Her eyes flickered, falling on his fingers before returning to his face. "So, what brings you to Lil?" he asked, trying to fill the silence that had suddenly fallen between them. He felt too visible under her gaze, his nervous energy a palpable thing. He picked up a sugar sachet and fiddled with it, a small distraction for his shaking hands. He watched her lips as she responded, a smile flitting across them before disappearing. Her eyes, he noticed, crinkled at the corners. Were they brown-green? Hazel? Freckles were sprinkled across her sunburnt cheeks, and he saw the small imperfections he'd overlooked before. A bit of peeling skin on her nose, some untrimmed nasal hair, an upper lip that needed waxing. He'd been so focused on her radiance,
that he hadn't seen the ordinary person beneath the veneer. She was far from perfect. She was just an individual with ordinary flaws and even mediocre ideas. He wouldn't idealize her, not this time. He couldn't afford to make the same mistake again. She would do, just like this, just as she was. And hadn't he grown? He was aware of his patterns, his tendency to project his fantasies onto women. "What about you?" she asked, her voice changing subtly as she switched to French. "Pourquoi es-tu venu à Lille?" Her accent was sweet, her voice regressing to that of a curious girl. It was that innocence, that desire to understand the world that made him want to burst with nervous laughter. He wanted to grab her hand, to kiss her feet. He was happy just to be in her orbit, to sit across from her in an orange summer dress, her eyes wide like a doe's. She was as pretty as a present with a ribbon tied around it. But he was no longer one to idealize, he reminded himself. Happy he was, but it was an ordinary happiness, a feeling that could belong to anyone. At least that's what he told himself. A few weeks later, they were in bed, the aftermath of a shared intimacy. "But you don't know me," she said, her head propped up on a pillow. "I know," Matu said. "I've been reminding myself that you're just another individual too, that you're flawed, that I'd have to accept that version of you." Nora sighed, her voice weary. "It sounds like you've been thinking a lot about me." "I have," he admitted. "You've been idealizing me, really. I'm trying not to, hence why I've been thinking about your flaws."
"But that's also obsessive," she said, her voice filled with a quiet frustration. "I don't want to be anybody's limerent object. It's reductive, dehumanizing even. Nobody ever sees me. They project their fantasies, their desires onto me." She gave an example. The way a guy named Limerent from the language exchange had grabbed her waist even after she flinched away. I can't just be, ever, it seems. Matthew felt a jolt of defensiveness. "Well, now you're making me feel guilty for being attracted to you," he said. "We can go back to being friends if it makes you feel better, but I'm not sure I'd be able to." Nora didn't respond right away. She dragged herself out of bed, the moment of shared vulnerability now a tense and uncomfortable silence. "Maybe," she said, her back to him. "Coffee?" The next morning, Nora scrolled through the pages and pages of text from Matthew. It was a digital tirade, a disproportionate and overwhelming response to her simple, boundary-setting message. "Hi, Matthew. I think we got carried away last night, and I'm feeling a little uncomfortable. Is it okay if we go back to being platonic? If so, are we still on for the fireworks? I would bring my friend along." His response was a cascade of indignation. "You can't tell me how to feel. My feelings are mine, and I care about you now. You initiated intimacy. Don't tell me not to get attached." Page after page of text, as if kissing him was a contract. "You're afraid of intimacy, but deep down I think you're open to a romantic connection. It's just that you've been hurt before. You're closed off, sure, but you're just scared." Page after page, as though kissing him was a sentence. He'd made her tea and microwaved leftovers, kissed her when she was drunk, and now he expected her to be emotionally responsible for this near stranger. They had met 3 times, at the language exchange, for coffee, and then for drinks after her bad date. And now he expected love, as if it were an exchange, a currency, a food stamp. He was starving, and he devoured the thought of her, licking the bones clean. Nora finally found the strength to write, "Matthew, I'm feeling overwhelmed. You've crossed several of my boundaries, and now you're psychoanalyzing me. Me, whom you don't even know. Maybe I'm afraid of intimacy, sure, but not with you. I simply don't want to be with you, and that's okay." She flinched at his response. "You should be more considerate about the feelings of those you decide to initiate intimacy with." The audacity of it made her hands tremble. She composed one last message. "Hi, Matthew. We don't know each other well enough to be having this kind of conversation or this level of emotional intensity.
It's inappropriate and unfair. I won't have it." He blocked her. But moments later, she received a new message, unblocked and relentless. "Sure, I shouldn't have sent you all that at once, but I stand by what I said. And it's none of my business what you're like with other men, regardless of my opinion. And I was dishonest about my emotions yesterday because I felt used, and rightfully so. Just send me your bank details so I can pay you back for the beers you insisted on buying me despite me expressing my discomfort. But I wish you the best here in Lil. We don't own the rights to how we're perceived or imagined by others, but that doesn't make it any less violating. What had he done with the very thought of her? And why could she feel it? Why was his fantasy of her so palpable, so sickeningly real? She could smell it hanging in the air like spoiled milk, a sour scent she couldn't escape. She could taste it in every forkful of instant noodles, the cheap, savory flavor curdling on her tongue. With a sudden jolt of disgust, she pushed her bowl aside, the fork clattering against the porcelain. She had lost her appetite entirely. A dry gag escaped her throat. Everything, the air, the food, the silence of her apartment, tasted, sounded, and smelled of him taking grotesque liberties with the idea of her. He hadn't seen her. Not really. He had pulled her apart and reassembled her like a Mrs. Potato Head, a toy he could manipulate to fit his own narrative. He was completely unaware that he was reducing her to a plaything. He'd stuck ears where they didn't belong, chose his favorite set of eyes from his own mind, and most cruelly, removed the mouth. Who needs a mouth, after all, when you're a blank screen for someone else's projections? You become arbitrary, rendered with just enough individuality to serve as the canvas for all their desires. And in their self-made reality, they genuinely believe it's not their imagination, but you. Nightmares sometimes linger, their fingerprints loud and luminescent on the waking world. Nora lay in bed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He'd followed her in the dream, his presence a dark shadow. Wide awake now, the terror was no longer contained by sleep. She rose from her bed, the floorboards cold against her bare feet, afraid she'd find him outside her apartment door or lurking in the stairwell. She fastened the chain lock, a useless gesture against the terror in her mind. She shut the curtains on the third floor, hoping to dispel the darkness that might morph into the man who had conjured up a narrative centered entirely around her, a man who seemed to believe in its reality, a narrative of him and her, despite its complete lack of reciprocity. It was limerence, she thought. Not love or admiration. It wasn't flattering. It was degrading, reductive, and dehumanizing. He'd poured all his expectations into her, as though she were a container, a heart-shaped cake pen he could fill with his desires. And she, by simply existing, had been forced to hold the sticky, unsavory mess he'd created. Matthew pulled at the doorknob, but it caught in its frame. It was locked. He just needed to speak to her in person. He needed to explain. The cold wind climbed up his spine and caressed his neck like a lover's hand. He sat on the curb, his shoulders hunched, watching a group of drunken girls stumble down the street. Their heels clinked like ghost stones on the pavement. One girl stumbled across the road, past him, her keys jangling. The metal scratched against the keyhole, the door creaking open. His dirty shoe was a door jamb, just in time. He followed her in and sat in the stairwell outside Nora's door. He rehearsed his lines in his head, then out loud. Knock, knock? If he could just speak to her in person. Knock, knock? He raised his hand, but then the girl from the first floor peered out of her door. She was small, with dark hair tied back in a messy bun. Her eyes were wide, and she held a phone in her hand. Is everything okay? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Matthew froze, his hand still suspended in the air. The girl didn't recognize him, not really, but he knew her. She was the one who had asked Nora if she was the organizer at the language exchange, the one who had mistaken her effortless warmth for a title. Now she saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had put in Nora's eyes. The illusion he had so carefully built shattered. He wasn't a lovelorn hero. He was just a man sitting on a stranger's stoop, terrifying her friends. He dropped his hand, stood up, and walked away. The Mrs. Potato Head he had constructed crumbled to dust behind him.